I will present you PolarSys. So PolarSys, not Polaris. It's PolarSys because it's sys like in system engineering, and Polars because we intend to be like this stable point in the sky, like the polar star. So it's how we found the name. So PolarSys is a working group at Eclipse for open source tools for embedded systems. So I will go through the history behind PolarSys and give you also some reasons why we implemented PolarSys in the Eclipse Foundation. So at the beginning, when we talk about embedded systems, it's this kind of embedded system, something like all the softwares that are embedded in Airbus aircraft. And in the first aircraft, there were maybe 4 kilobytes of code or something like code. And if you consider the A380, you have hundreds. 100 megabytes of code, so that's something really significant. So those guys as Airbus, they have they need new means to develop embedded systems and to develop reliable embedded systems, like you were describing. And also, well, that's my slide. So they have a very long life cycles. And when 80 years is maybe a bit like a big number, and you may think it's not the truth, but I just want to tell you that 2 or 3, well, in the last 5 years, they started to develop the A320 Neo. So they changed the engine in the aircraft, and actually they still use some tool chains they developed in at the beginning of the 80s, and those tool chains are running on a virtual layer emulating VAX VMS. So that's well, we are 30 years after, they are still working with the same tool chain. So it's a true number. And I put this slide from Airbus presentation about their history in tooling. And at the beginning, they started to develop. They were developing everything in-house. And but the problem with developing everything in-house is that you need strong skills for this development, and also you have some cost for development and the maintenance phase, and it was clearly out of the business for Airbus. So in the 90s, they were asked to switch to proprietary products, and it looks like in the next slide you will see that some of those proprietary products were just these products outsourced to contractors, and they realized after some time that they were having some kind of vendor lock-in, and also that customizing commercial product was not as easy when you were then customizing in-house product. And that long-term availability of the tools was not guaranteed at all. So that's also my slide. Yes, you're right. So if you look at some of those tools, I guess you know this one, for example, and you may not know that it was initially a development inside Airbus Research Center. But what you can see is that working in the continuity of those tools was not something obvious, because the tools were acquired, tool providers were acquired several times. Some tools disappeared because in an acquisition, for example, there was no interest by the new the new company in these tools. And so at some point, they started to think about what about open source. So it was 10 years ago. And I think that this is the way they present it now. And I'm not sure they had such a long list of requirements from the beginning. But the idea with open source is that you have a chance to master the tools. You can ensure the durability in line with, well, you have access to the code, so you can make sure that you can continue working on the tools, and you have a lot of properties linked to the open source characteristics of the tools, and also. Open source is not enough. You have some conditions for the success, and one of the conditions for the success is to build a viable community. So also, well, we can go deeper into the open source software properties, and I think that we will agree that open source software facilitates interoperability because you have access to the data format, for example, and to the code to write and read the data formats. It's a mean to create de facto standards, because when you have a good open source implementation, then everybody starts using it, so it becomes a de facto standard. Migration is also easier. Extensibility is easier because you can go into the tools and find the right extension point. And it's also a good way of implementing open innovation. But let's come back to the Airbus the Airbus history. In 2004, they started to think about creating tools for the engineering of their systems, creating tools in open source. And the project was the first project funded by Aerospace Valley, which is a cluster, aeronautic cluster in southwest of France. It was the first project funded, and it was from the beginning. The goal was to create open source toolkit for critical application and system development. And so the goal was really to work to provide tools for model-based system engineering, code generation, document generation, and so on. After a few years of development, they were able to use it for some projects on the A350 and the A380. But the question was, okay, we developed an initial version, and but we have an open source toolchain, but we still don't have a community. So they created the OPs project, and OPs, the goal of OPs was to create a European community. At the beginning, it was really a community, an open source community around Toulouse, and the goal of OPs was to make it European-wide. So we had 28 partners out of 5 European countries, and there was some development in the toolchain, but also the main goal of the project was to establish a sustainable ecosystem to ensure the sustainability of the toolchain and of the ecosystem after the end of the project. We spent almost 1 year thinking about, do we have to implement this ecosystem by creating yet another open source consortium, or do we join the Eclipse Foundation and create a working group inside the Eclipse Foundation? And so we studied several aspects, including the financial aspect, and finally, at the unanimity, the consortium decided that it was more interesting and more reliable, more sustainable to work with the Eclipse Foundation, because we wanted to create a long-lasting, sustainable ecosystem. And first, it was a good idea to work with an ecosystem like Eclipse that have proven to be sustainable in the last 10 years. Also, in terms of legal framework, when you work with the Eclipse Foundation, you have all the legal framework to share the intellectual property and to create products on top of your open source toolkit. The project governance, which is well-established open source governance, working for more than 200 projects, so it's operational. And good IT infrastructure, a technology platform for the Eclipse technology, Eclipse platform, and marketing and communication. And also, I think that it's not here, but in marketing and communication, it's interesting that the Eclipse Foundation is a worldwide organization, and we were a group of European companies with a strong center in France. And by joining the Eclipse Foundation, we managed to become global, which is very important, because for open source is de facto open source is quickly global. So PolarSys has an so I had a question about what is the difference during the break. What is the difference between PolarSys and OPs? So OPs was just the name of the ITA funded project, and PolarSys is the name we selected for the working group inside the Eclipse Foundation. So with PolarSys, we extend also what the Eclipse Foundation is providing. We leverage the Eclipse Foundation infrastructure and legal framework and so on, but we also extend it to ensure to work on quality and maturity of the tools, because we need mature tools to develop these embedded systems, and that's something that is not part of the culture of the Eclipse ecosystem, which is more a developer-driven ecosystem. So we work a lot on quality and maturity assessment. We also work on implementing very long-term support. By very long-term support, I mean that the Eclipse platform is supported for 9 months by the community, because each year there is a new version of the Eclipse platform which is released in June, and you have a first service release in September and another service release in February. And after that, after the second service release, everybody works on the new synchronous release. So by default, the community, an open source community like Eclipse, supports its release for 9 months, and we want to provide the means to the PolarSys members to get support for 10 years or 20 years if needed. So that's what we call very long-term support. And also, we are working on tools qualification. So the idea behind tools qualification is to share base documentation that enter in the qualification process, and for example, to share the specifications, the test descriptions, and so on. So, and members will get an easier, shorter path between for qualification, because they take this base documentation and put them in their context. And we can share such base documentation for the DO 178 for aerospace, ISO 26262, or the ECSS E40 for the space. So that's what we had. And also, here is the the big picture of how we set up this this working group. The idea, the main idea was to switch from a situation in which users like Airbus, Thales, Ericsson, and others, they acquire their tools from a tools vendor, and then after that they send their request for improvement or request for bug fixing and so on to the tools vendor, and the tools vendor selects what improvements they want to put in the roadmap, and they have, well, they have very few control on that. And the idea with moving to PolarSys is that you have no vendor lock-in because you are in an open source landscape, and we created technology user driven ecosystem. So that's end user group together, share their requirements, and put their requirements on the table, and after that they find service providers, even sometimes tools vendors or other open source contributors to work together. And the idea is basically to get 80% of generic features, and with the open source nature of the tool chain, to be able to extend it to completely adapt the tool chain to the company process instead of adapting the company process to the tools. So, just a few words about Eclipse Working Groups. So, I understood that most of you know Eclipse. Not all of you, but Ralph and myself are.
I said not everybody is a member yet.
Okay. We can help for that. So, Eclipse, yes. On this slide, you can see there is the Eclipse Foundation, and the main product, the main platform is IDE, the Java and C IDE, and so on. You have the platform with which you can develop any kind of application, and you have the working groups. Working groups is the application of business-friendly open source management we do at Eclipse to other domains than desktop and IDE applications. So the domains are PolarSys, which is these open source tools for embedded systems, but also Internet of Things with the M2M working group, Location Tech, which is about geospatial aware middleware, Automotive working group to share a platform between tool vendors in the automotive domain, long-term support. That's interesting because in long-term support that's software vendors that who work together to implement support for 10 years in the platform. And Science Working Group, which is more about creating an Eclipse platform for physicists, for chemists and biologists. So in this PolarSys working group, as you see, Topcase, for those of you who knew Topcase decided to migrate everything to PolarSys. So all the non-experimental projects of Topcase are migrating to PolarSys, and everything will be migrated by next June. Also, I was telling you that one advantage we get by joining the Eclipse Foundation is that we have one full day of conference at the next EclipseCon in San Francisco, and I think that for us, one of the main goals is to reach US company, North American company, to get members in North America and to go outside of Europe, and that's really a good opportunity that maybe that would have been much more difficult to achieve on our own. What else? I think that I already talked about that. our members. So our members are, we started with from the aerospace industry. So we have Airbus, we have Astrium, now Airbus Defense and Space. We have Thales, and we also have CA, the energy research center in France, and Ericsson. In these strategic members, we already have a Swedish and Canadian company, because Ericsson is a Swedish company, but we also work a lot on the Eclipse tools with the Canadian Research Center. And also international companies like Thales, which deploys the tools outside Europe also. Participating members are mainly service providers who are here to implement the new features needed by the strategic members. We have members in Sweden, in Italy, and the rest are French members. So we manage in PolarSys, and I think that mainly thanks to the implementation with Eclipse, we managed to create a global ecosystem. Just this slide also is important. I just want to say that here we have the concept of super communities, and PolarSys is a typical super community. I mean that at the beginning you had open source by hackers, then open source with communities, with individual-driven communities like Apache or the Free Software Foundation. I mean that people contributing to these communities contribute on their own, not for their company. Open source with business ecosystems like the Eclipse Foundation. The members at the Eclipse Foundation are companies, and even if the committers are developers. And what we create with PolarSys is a user-driven ecosystem, and such a user-driven ecosystem adds another level of governance in the Eclipse ecosystem, in the open source ecosystem, because you have the users. The users can enter the game without the need to have committers, and that's very important because it's not easy for large companies like Airbus or others to have committers in all the projects that interest them. So quickly, what we do in PolarSys, we want to address all the V process, and of course there are domains in which we are better for the moment, because we have this history of model-based system engineering. So we are very good at modeling. We have good tools for compiler, debuggers, also static analysis, and some tools, some domains for which we still need to do some improvement, but typically there's a room for new members coming and contributing to the funding of new domains. It's important also to understand that in PolarSys we want to deliver projects that can be used out of the box, but that can also be extended in this business layer. And this business layer, it's typically the place where tools vendors can add some extra value, or where the place where users can adapt the tools to their specific processes. So finally, it's certainly open source is certainly a good trade-off. If we come back to the initial question from Airbus, it's certainly a good trade-off between make or buy, because they can either rely on service providers, on tools vendors, or they can also invest directly in specific features that are important for them. And with open tools, it's much easier to extend and to and also to find people to work on the project. So it's business friendly open source. I mean that there is professional support, there are bug fixes by experts, and there are typically contracts to add features. Those contracts are not managed by PolarSys. PolarSys is the place where the users and the service providers meet, but they have direct contracts between for the development of new features. So we started in aeronautics, aerospace, telecom, defense, but of course, it's railway here. I have to update it. Of course, we have we think that those tools, those open source tools for embedded system, are adapted for other domains, and so I think that we can talk about that during lunch. That's all. I don't know if you have questions.
Thank you, Gaël.
You're welcome.
For your presentation. I think it was a perfect example of what the group of companies can do using open source development process with their own business model behind. And it's an example which we will certainly use in all of the 3 sessions in the afternoon. From the governance, it is the industry working group you have chosen,
yeah.
or the legal aspects, why you have integrated yourself into the Eclipse Foundation, and from a business model, it's very good reasons to do that as well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Eine Verständnisfrage.
Well, actually, it's not a question. Or maybe it's one. I like
Go
your
ahead.
slide with the make or buy
Yeah.
issue, because obviously it's
You can get it if you want.
Can I have it?
Yeah.
Great. No, but it seems to be some kind of a solution for that dilemma where you're always in when you have to make that decision. Because if you go to the buy decision, then you have it in your own organization. Well, if you get in a buy, you're losing control. You get only control for the, let's say, initial buy. The follow-up is always this vendor lock-in situation. And if you're in the make decision path, then you always have it on your own pocket. And all the expense and so on coming up.
Maybe a short answer. Well, what the good aspect of working groups like PolarSys regarding to that is that first you can buy something, but also make sure in your contract that your provider works on a neutral third-party infrastructure like the one we operate at Eclipse or PolarSys. So, and you make sure that they are using best practices for build and test and so on, because it's seen by all the community. And the other point is that even after just 2 years of operation of PolarSys, we have strong collaborations set up between the end users. And this year, for example, there are some contracts for development that integrate requirements from other users. I mean that one user says, okay, this year I will fund this specific development. Who is interested in that? And other user comes with, well, I would like this requirement. Is it possible? And they pay maybe a bit more for the features, for the contract, but they make sure that there are other users in the community, and that after the end of the contract, other users will be interested in support and so on.
Okay.
Well, let's talk about that later. You're welcome.